Dana Helms had not intended to come back, not to this particular state, not to the region where her younger years were marked with dust, rigid tradition, and the kind of neighbors who smiled only when they wanted something. But after 27 years of transit contracts, warehouse audits, supplier disputes, and 6 relocations, she wanted something that resembled stillness. A place where she didn't wake to the groan of delivery trucks or the snap of fluorescent bulbs. So she came back. Not to the same street or even the same town, but close enough that the familiar scent of wood smoke and sun-baked asphalt crept into her bones in the early mornings. The house itself was modest, a single-level ranch style tucked into the outer edge of a carefully manicured subdivision that called itself Ashwood Terrace. The name was too polished for Dana's taste, too market-tested and glossy, but the house had solid bones, thick walls, a proper foundation, and, most importantly, land. Not a postage stamp yard, not a strip of grass between fences, but actual land. Her plot bordered what had once been a drainage easement, now grown wild with cedar and bramble, and beyond that, a thinned-out path that led to another street. That path would become the beginning of all her trouble, though she didn't know it yet. At first, she simply noticed the foot traffic. Dana worked from home now, taking on freelance logistics contracts, meaning her eyes caught things others might miss. Every day around the same time, early mornings, mid-afternoons, and just after sunset, people wandered past the rear line of her yard. Not directly in it, not quite trespassing, but uncomfortably close. There was no formal sidewalk, just a habit trail stamped into the grass by years of casual shortcuts, winding its way from the inner rows of the neighborhood to the main street beyond. Joggers, dog walkers, teens with earbuds, older women in yoga pants, they all used it like it was a public greenbelt. Dana found it odd that no fence had ever been built to define the boundary, but assumed the previous owner either didn't mind or didn't notice. She minded. Dana didn't like being observed. She didn't like the occasional nod or wave from strangers who clearly believed they had a right to walk near her bedroom windows. She certainly didn't like that some of them cut diagonally across the edge of her grass to save 6 seconds. The first time she brought it up at the community meeting, her voice was even, firm, not hostile. She asked for clarification. Was that strip of land private? Were there easements? Were there rights of way she should know about? The response was vague at best. A man with thinning hair and a khaki windbreaker introduced himself as the head of the residential committee, not officially city government, but influential nonetheless, and told her that, technically, the land behind her house belonged to the original developer but had been historically used by residents as an access corridor. Dana asked if it was recorded as such. He shrugged. "It's just always been that way," he said, as if that settled it. A few people chuckled. She didn't. The next day, Dana filled out a formal application to erect a 6-foot fence enclosing her back and side yards. She included all required documentation, including her plat map, deed, and photographs showing the route people used. She highlighted that the path was informal, unmarked, and bordered her private property. Within a week, the denial arrived. In clipped, professional language, the committee stated that her proposed fence interfered with communal visual harmony and restricted traditional pedestrian access routes utilized by community members. It recommended a less obstructive barrier, such as decorative edging, shrubbery, or partial fencing, not exceeding 4 feet in height. Dana reread the letter 3 times. Communal visual harmony? The lot behind hers was full of overgrown brush and discarded beer cans. Traditional pedestrian access routes? Since when did habits qualify as rights? She appealed, of course. She requested an in-person review. The committee granted her 10 minutes at their next meeting. Dana wore a clean blazer and carried a folder of printouts. Case law regarding property rights, zoning maps from the county office, photos of litter left by passers-by, and a highlighted section of her title clearly stating there were no easements or rights-of-way on her parcel. She spoke calmly, clearly. She didn't raise her voice. When she was finished, the committee chair leaned back, scratched his chin, and asked, "Do you really think it's necessary to cut off your neighbors from something they've used for so long?" Dana blinked. That wasn't the point, and he knew it. Another woman piped up, saying something about community spirit, and how Ashwood Terrace prided itself on openness. Dana gathered her documents and left without another word. She didn't slam the door, but she shut it firmly enough. That night, she stayed up past midnight reading about informal use rights, adverse possession, prescriptive easements, none of which applied, but all of which frustrated her. What she came to realize was that the committee wasn't relying on law. They were relying on pressure, social norms, unspoken expectations. She was the outsider, the new one, the woman with the sharp voice and the blunt logic. She didn't get it, and that was her sin. They didn't need legal ground to stand on. They just needed her to feel uncomfortable enough to give in. That was the night Dana decided she would not give in. The idea came slowly, then all at once. If a fence was too aggressive, too disruptive to their sensibilities, then she'd go natural. She started researching fast-growing, hardy, dense hedging species. She ruled out boxwoods and laurels. They took too long and didn't have teeth. What she wanted was defensive landscaping. She landed on Pyracantha angustifolia, a species with razor-sharp thorns, quick spread, and evergreen density. In the spring, it bloomed with small white flowers. In winter, it bore clusters of red-orange berries. Some people used it to deter deer or burglars. Dana would use it to deter busybodies. The first week of planting was grueling. The ground was rocky, and roots from old junipers fought her shovel at every turn. But Dana worked steadily, planting row after row along the invisible line between her yard and the so-called traditional path. She didn't mention it to anyone. She didn't post about it online. She simply did the work. By the end of the second week, over 300 thorn bushes were in the ground. A week later, that number had doubled. Neighbors watched but said nothing. Occasionally, someone would walk by and offer a tight smile or a raised brow. Dana gave them nothing in return. By the end of the month, she had planted over 1,000. That's when the retaliation began. Small at first. Someone left a laminated sign wedged into one of the bushes. "This is a community, not a prison." Another day, she found a plastic bag of dog waste hung deliberately from a branch. One morning, her trash bins were overturned. Another, someone scraped the passenger side of her car with what looked like a house key. Dana didn't panic. She documented everything, took photos, and filed quiet reports. But what gnawed at her wasn't the petty vandalism. It was the fact that no one acknowledged what was happening. Not to her face. She wasn't being attacked directly. She was being shunned, silently marked as the enemy. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had dared to say, "This is mine. You don't get to walk through it just because you always have." She had lived long enough, moved through enough cities and cold conference rooms to know what this was. It wasn't a legal fight. It was a social one. And the thorns she had planted were only the beginning. The bushes had taken root with ruthless speed. What had started as a natural solution now formed a dense, winding barricade, taller than most people's knees and armed with needlepoint thorns that caught on fabric and drew blood without warning. Dana kept them trimmed just enough to avoid accusations of overgrowth, but she allowed them to spread horizontally, strategically, encouraging them to knit together into something no jogger, stroller, or casual dog walker could comfortably bypass. The makeshift trail behind her property had become a choke point. The foot traffic thinned noticeably. Strangers stopped waving. Some chose to walk with exaggerated detours, muttering loud enough for Dana to hear from her kitchen window. One man lingered at the edge of the brush one afternoon, shaking his head and snapping a picture with his phone, but didn't say a word. She'd expected pushback. She'd prepared for irritation, maybe even a meeting or two to clarify intentions. What she didn't expect was the letter delivered to her door not by mail, but by hand, folded into a sleek black envelope and dropped beneath her doormat. It bore no return address, just the words, "Notice of Violation," embossed in silver across the front. Inside, the document was cold and precise, a formal citation for creating an unapproved hazardous barrier within shared access proximity. The phrasing was deliberately ambiguous, rooted in bylaws Dana had already read cover to cover, none of which defined shared access proximity in any legally binding way. The penalty listed was a $500 fine and a directive to remove all aggressive vegetation encroaching upon the traditional path within 14 days to avoid escalation. There was no signature, just a stamp from the Ashwood Community Oversight Office. Dana stood in her living room for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, not from fear but from something colder, contempt. Not only had they denied her the right to erect a fence on her own land, they were now attempting to penalize her for planting shrubbery. Thorny or not, these were still plants. And the committee's threat, because that's what it was, no matter how politely formatted, was an escalation that went beyond passive disapproval. It was strategic, administrative bullying. Dana knew the difference. She'd built half her career countering it. She made copies of the notice, scanned and saved them to 3 different folders on her laptop, and set the originals in a labeled envelope. Then she called her attorney, not the expensive zoning lawyer she'd consulted before, but an older acquaintance from her freight logistics days who had transitioned into local municipal law. He listened quietly as she laid out the situation, asked her to send the documents, and promised to follow up. "You're not the first to deal with this kind of thing," he said dryly, "but that letter is skating the edge of enforceability, Dana. I'd advise you not to respond directly. Let me handle the paper trail." 2 days later, Dana received another knock on her door. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was a woman, mid-40s, sharp red lipstick, pearl earrings, clipboard held like a weapon. She introduced herself as Carol. No last name, just Carol. "I'm here on behalf of the Community Beautification Panel," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've had some concerns brought to our attention about recent changes to your property line. I'd like to take a quick walk around and make some notes if that's all right." Dana crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have jurisdiction on private property. If you have questions, send them in, writing to my attorney." Carol's smile flickered just slightly. "Of course. It's just that neighbors have mentioned some injuries, scratches mostly, and a few complaints about pets getting caught in the brush. I thought it might be helpful to address this informally, without involving enforcement." Dana didn't move. "I'll stick with formal channels. You can leave your card." Carol didn't offer one. She left without argument, but as she walked away, Dana watched her pause at the edge of the thorns and snap another photo with her phone. There was something performative about it, as though Carol wasn't documenting for herself, but staging a scene for someone else. Dana noted the time, logged the visit, and later emailed it to her attorney with a brief description of Carol's demeanor. She also installed 2 more cameras that evening, one facing the rear path, the other angled toward the far side gate. By the following week, her attorney had drafted a cease and desist letter, referencing both her plat records and the lack of any recorded easement. It was addressed not to any individual, but to the committee at large, a move Dana appreciated for its precision. The message was clear. She would not comply with unlawful directives, and she would not tolerate surveillance or intimidation on private property. It was the right move, but it didn't stop the next escalation. One morning, Dana awoke to the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, along the back fence. She peered through the blinds and saw two men in matching gray shirts walking the perimeter. They carried measuring wheels and clipboards. At first, she thought they were surveyors, but there had been no notice, no scheduling, no reason for them to be there. She stepped outside and called out. They didn't answer, just kept walking. One of them raised a phone and took a photo of the yard. Dana called out again, sharper. This time, one of them turned and held up a laminated badge clipped to his collar. Community Infrastructure Assessment. That was it. She asked who sent them. No reply. She told them to leave. They did, but slowly, without apology, and without acknowledgement of her rights. It wasn't just invasive, it was calculated. Dana knew this wasn't a random inspection. It was an effort to create a file, an informal, undocumented file, to frame her as a problem resident. Later that afternoon, her internet cut out without warning. The provider logged the issue as a maintenance adjustment, though no maintenance had been scheduled. Her mail arrived soaking wet, inside a sealed box. Her trash bin was missing for 2 days. Her grocery delivery driver reported someone redirecting traffic on her street the previous morning, though no city work was recorded. Nothing serious on its own. Nothing that could be proven. But each small disruption stacked like stones on her spine. Heavy, deliberate. Still, Dana did not back down. She doubled down. The next weekend, she spent 14 hours reinforcing the base of the Thorn barrier with compacted soil and iron mesh to prevent digging. She left no gaps. She replaced the mulch with gravel. Sharp, unpleasant, unwalkable barefoot. She planted low creeping juniper just inside the perimeter, dense enough to mask the mesh, but not thick enough to invite rabbits. At night, her security lights caught more movement than usual. People lingering, pointing, but no one stepped onto her property again. They knew. The message was clear. And the tension now was not just passive. It was coiled. Waiting. Dana had drawn a line. Not just with bushes or fences or paperwork, but with action. They wanted her to blink, to apologize, to yield. She wouldn't. What they didn't understand yet, what they hadn't grasped, was that Dana didn't plant those bushes out of spite. She planted them because they were a warning, and the next time someone crossed that line, they wouldn't be met with silence. 3 weeks after the last warning letter, Dana opened her front door to find a pale yellow citation affixed to her mailbox with painter's tape. It looked almost benign, like something the city might leave for improper recycling. But when she pulled it free, the contents were anything but neutral. It accused her of willful obstruction of community pathways, landscaping that posed physical harm to passers-by, and non-participatory behavior undermining neighborhood cohesion. It was unsigned, again, and beneath the accusations was a line that she read, "This matter will be reviewed at the monthly community board session. Attendance strongly recommended." No date, no time. Just another vague threat dressed in the language of bureaucratic concern. Dana didn't react immediately. She took the paper inside, scanned it, logged it, then went about her day as if it had never arrived. But deep beneath the layer of calm documentation, something else had begun to stir. A darker, colder determination that was no longer about rights or property lines. This was psychological warfare, plain and deliberate. That same day, she received an email from a local landscaping supply company she'd used once for mulch delivery. The message stated they could no longer serve her address due to conflict-related limitations imposed by neighborhood leadership. She hadn't ordered anything recently, so the message confused her at first. When she called to clarify, the woman on the phone paused, then lowered her voice. "Ma'am, we were told your property was flagged. Informally. Off the books. We're not supposed to get involved." Dana didn't press her. She thanked the woman and hung up. She had all she needed. Whoever was pulling the strings behind these petty acts wasn't doing it alone anymore. They were networking, blocking her from services, squeezing her through reputation and silence. That night, Dana walked the perimeter of her property with a flashlight, noting new footprints in the gravel, scuff marks where someone had brushed the thorn bushes back. At the southern edge near the utility box, she found a cigarette butt still warm. Marlboro Lights. No neighbor she'd ever seen smoked. She reached the corner where the trail once flowed freely and found something new, a stack of broken bricks and cinder blocks placed at deliberate angles, forming makeshift steps around the barrier she'd planted. Someone had literally engineered a workaround, low, ugly, but functional. A cheat path meant to restore the community's freedom of movement. Dana stared at it in silence, her flashlight beam trailing over the muddy tread marks left behind by bike tires and worn sneakers. Her jaw clenched, not in fury, but in calculation. They weren't waiting for approvals anymore. They were acting. Quietly, aggressively, and with a sense of ownership that didn't belong to them. The following morning, Dana called her attorney and laid out the events, detail by detail. She was done reacting. She wanted preemptive action. He advised her to prepare a formal trespass notice and deliver it to the board, along with security footage and property boundary confirmation from the county. But even as he laid out the strategy, he sounded weary. "You're doing everything right," he said, "but understand this. They're not thinking like homeowners. They're thinking like a hive. The minute you challenged one part, they restructured around it. It's not about your land anymore. It's about the fact that you said no." That same afternoon, she received a call from a soft-spoken man claiming to be part of the local mediation council, an unofficial body meant to resolve neighborhood disputes before they escalate into legal action. Dana asked for his name, his office, his credentials. He hesitated, stumbled, then admitted the council was entirely volunteer-based and did not represent any government entity. She told him to delete her number and to never call again. An hour later, someone rang her doorbell and left before she could answer. She found a canvas tote bag on her porch with a folded pamphlet inside. Community Solutions, Bridging Divides with Compassion. It was printed on recycled paper. Dana dropped it into the trash without unfolding it. That evening, she heard noises outside around 11 p.m. Not voices, just movement. A low rustle, the crunch of shifting gravel. Her security camera captured two figures creeping along the back fence line. Not teenagers, not loiterers. Grown men, moving slowly, looking not to vandalize, but to study. One of them paused and reached into the thorn barrier with a stick, as if testing its resistance. The other held what looked like a clipboard or tablet. They spent 8 minutes in total, then walked away without touching anything else. Dana reviewed the footage twice, sent it to her attorney, and then backed it up to an encrypted cloud drive. Whatever this was, it was no longer passive. They were mapping her defenses. The next morning, Dana called a private contractor she knew from her time in logistics, someone she'd once hired to install perimeter detection systems for warehouse facilities. She asked him to come by quietly. He installed vibration sensors under her gravel perimeter and linked them to an alert system on her phone. "Nothing lethal," she said, "just awareness." He didn't ask questions. That same week, she discovered that her water bill had tripled despite no change in her usage. A call to the utility company revealed a manual override on the irrigation meter registered the previous weekend. She didn't have manual irrigation. Someone had accessed her panel and tampered with it. The technician was sympathetic, but careful with his words. "You may want to keep an eye on the lock," he said. "We see this in neighborhoods with territorial committees." Then came the petition. Not mailed, not emailed. Hand-delivered again, this time tucked into her front storm door, folded in thirds like a takeout menu. It was titled Community Action Statement, and bore 37 names, most of them handwritten. The wording was careful. A request that Dana reconsider the continued installation and maintenance of hazardous vegetation that may present risks to both children and pets. It didn't demand, didn't threaten. It suggested. But the list of names wasn't what chilled her. It was the final line. We hope you choose unity over isolation. This is our home, too. There it was, the doctrine of shared entitlement masked as diplomacy. A community trying to shame one person into compliance because their convenience had been challenged. Dana spent the next several hours cataloging everything. She scanned the petition, checked public property records, matched names to addresses. Most were real. A few weren't. 2 of them matched owners who hadn't lived in the neighborhood for years. One was the name of a woman who died 8 months earlier, confirmed by public obituary. Dana printed everything, then drove to the county clerk's office to verify her boundaries in person. The clerk, an older woman with a steady demeanor, confirmed there were no easements, no shared access rights, no trails, no claims. You own it outright, she said. If anyone's walking through it, they're trespassing. That night, someone left a single garden glove hanging on the gate to Dana's back entrance. It wasn't hers. The thorns were smeared with fresh blood near the spot where someone had apparently tried to climb through again. She didn't call the police, not because she was afraid, but because she knew there was nothing they would do. Not for a glove, not for a scraped hand, not for a middle-aged woman at war with a neighborhood addicted to its own traditions. Instead, she turned off the porch light, sat at her dining table, and began drafting a letter of her own. Not a complaint, not a response, but a declaration. Not to the board, not to her neighbors, but to herself. A set of principles. Boundaries not just of land, but of resolve. She would not remove the bushes. She would not apologize. She would not entertain manipulative outreach dressed in borrowed civility. And if they wanted war, they would have to drag themselves through every inch of those thorns to get it. Because Dana Helms had made a mistake. She had assumed reason would be enough. Now she understood. Reason was irrelevant in a place where people mistook habit for ownership and pressure for authority. What they had asked her to yield was not just soil, it was dignity, and they would never get it. The first real crack in the wall didn't come from the committee or a neighbor with a clipboard. It came from a man in a faded button-down shirt with an envelope tucked under his arm and a quiet expression that suggested he had no intention of staying long. Dana opened the door warily that morning, already halfway expecting another impromptu inspector or passive-aggressive volunteer with a speech rehearsed in the mirror. But this man didn't introduce himself with titles. He simply said, "I'm from Records," and handed her the envelope without further explanation. When she asked him to clarify which department, he shook his head and muttered, "External filing support," before turning back toward his truck and driving off without another word. The envelope bore the return address of a regional property research firm she didn't recognize. Private, not public, but the contents inside were legitimate enough to stop her breath for a moment. What she held was a series of scanned plats, original zoning maps, and copies of correspondence between the original developer of Ashwood Terrace and the county dating back almost 30 years. And in one of those maps, dated and certified, a note appeared in the margin. Pathway to be considered non-dedicated and temporary. Access not to be carried forward beyond Phase 2 build-out. Dana read the line again and again. It was small, just a side annotation, but its meaning was absolute. That winding path behind her property, it was never intended to exist. Not officially, not legally, not permanently. It had been a makeshift pass-through during early construction, nothing more. It didn't absolve everything. It didn't erase the culture of entitlement that had ballooned around the path over the years. But it gave her something solid, something with a timestamp, and it proved definitively that the foundation of this war was built on myth. She didn't know who had sent it. Her attorney hadn't. She hadn't filed for the records herself, and when she called the number listed in the corner of the cover page, it rang 4 times and disconnected. The gesture felt deliberate, as if someone behind the scenes, someone with access, had decided she deserved to know the truth, but couldn't afford to be seen giving it. With new momentum, Dana called her attorney and sent him digital copies of everything. He responded in under 20 minutes, this time with visible urgency in his tone. "This changes the field," he said. "I can file a formal record annotation request with the county. If they accept the map as valid, it undermines any argument of long-standing implied access. You need to hold the line." And she did, for a time. But then came the second shift. Not in paperwork, not in warnings, but in tactics. Her cameras caught less activity, but her yard began changing without footsteps. Someone began leaving offerings. First, a series of small rocks stacked deliberately near the fence, then a child's toy left perfectly centered at the edge of her gravel, its wheels buried into the dirt. Then a note, not threatening, not angry, just one sentence written in blue pen. "This land belonged to all of us once." There was no signature, no context. Dana stood over it for several minutes before crumpling it in silence. She didn't know if the message was meant to guilt her or intimidate her, but it was clear now. Her resistance wasn't just irritating them. It was triggering something deeper, some strange communal grief for a convenience they'd elevated to the level of a right. Her attorney moved quickly. Within 4 days, he had filed an official motion with the planning office, including the old zoning documents and Dana's existing deed. He called it preventive action against informal reclassification. But the filing triggered more than just paperwork. It sparked something public. Without warning, someone began distributing a flyer, cheap paper, photocopied in black and white, titled "When Good Neighbors Go Rogue." Dana found the first copy pinned to her front gate with a thumbtack. She found another inside her recycling bin. The flyer included no address, no name, but it described her yard in clear enough detail that anyone nearby would know. It accused her of blocking communal access, fostering hostility, and intentionally weaponizing foliage. It urged residents to gather in unity and demand accountability for actions that threaten our shared peace. There was no author, no organizer, just a printed email address at the bottom ending in a vague domain, at neighborhoodvoice.org. She checked the domain registry. It was brand new, registered 2 days prior. Private. Dana felt her stomach coil, not from fear, but from the claustrophobic realization that her resistance had shifted from nuisance to pariah status. She wasn't just the woman with the thorns now. She was the villain in a campaign, one being curated not by any one person but by a coordinated whisper network of quiet, smiling adversaries who waved from across driveways and then met behind closed doors to circulate talking points. Her crime wasn't legal. It was ideological. She'd broken the spell of polite compliance, and in communities like this that was worse than anything else. For a few days, it was quiet. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but outwardly calm. She watered the bushes. She mowed the lawn. She placed an extra camera near the utility box and installed a remote relay in the attic, just in case. But then, on a Thursday afternoon, as the sky boiled with the weight of a summer storm, a marked envelope appeared in her mailbox. Not from the board. Not from a committee. This one was from the law firm representing Ashwood Residential Holdings, the parent company behind the neighborhood's development. It was brief, 2 pages, outlining a potential interest in revisiting boundary agreements due to unforeseen disruption of resident continuity. There was no formal accusation, just an invitation to open dialogue. Dana didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew what it meant. The real owners of the land were watching now. Not just the self-appointed volunteers who hosted potlucks and printed rules on cardstock. The ones with real money, real lawyers, and real motivation to resolve dissent before it became a legal precedent. It was the moment Dana had feared, but also the one she had anticipated. because when real power moves in, it does so quietly at first. Then, all at once, and she understood now that what she was defending wasn't just her yard. It was the line between fiction and fact, between myth and record, between expectation and right, and whatever came next, she would not surrender that line. Not for comfort, not for ease, not even for peace. The storm didn't arrive as forecasted. It waited. It hovered in the sky for hours like a clenched jaw, delaying its downpour while something much darker unfolded on the ground. Dana had grown accustomed to the routine warnings, vague citations, polite threats, shadowy visits from self-appointed representatives. She had fortified her land, prepared her legal defenses, even hardened her state of mind. But nothing prepared her for what happened the morning she stepped out and saw that the eastern line of her property had been violated. Not symbolically or subtly, but with industrial precision. Overnight, someone had used landscaping tools, professional grade, to cut and dig out an entire section of her thorn barricade, removing nearly 30 feet of thick-rooted bushes as cleanly as if they had never been there. The soil had been raked flat, the stump remnants hidden with a layer of mulch, and in the place where her living fence once stood, a narrow dirt trail had been re-established, freshly stomped by what must have been a parade of footsteps to compact it, that tightly. It didn't look like vandalism. It looked like infrastructure. Quiet, deliberate construction. No mess, no debris, just absence. The kind that tells you someone wanted it erased. Dana froze in the doorway, coffee untouched in her hand, her mind trying to reject what her eyes had already confirmed. She walked the edge of the damage, noting the clean lines, the surgical nature of the cut. This wasn't the work of neighborhood kids. This had planning, resources, and immunity written all over it. The surrounding bushes were untouched, their thorns now exposed at odd angles like the broken teeth of a once uniform jawline. The insult of it all wasn't just the destruction, it was the confidence behind it. Whoever did this knew she would see it, knew she'd know who was responsible, and they didn't care. She called the police, not because she thought they would solve anything, but because she needed the incident recorded. The officer who arrived was polite, took photos, wrote a report, and told her to call the zoning department if she suspected unauthorized land use. Dana handed him the official plat copy and a notarized letter from the county clerk confirming her ownership. The officer's expression shifted, if only slightly. He nodded, then said, "You'll want to check with your lawyer. This is beyond us." Her lawyer was already en route by the time she hung up. When he arrived, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He took measurements, photographed tire tracks left behind the fence line, and paced the area in silence. "They planned this," he said finally. "Someone hired a company willing to do the work off record. This isn't the board. This came from someone with money." Dana already knew that. The question now was, how far would that someone go? The answer came faster than she expected. That afternoon, while she reviewed footage from her security cameras, none of which had captured the breach, likely due to signal interference or deliberate jamming, she received an email from a mediator with a local real estate dispute firm. The message was brief and painfully formal. "We have been retained to facilitate a resolution concerning ongoing conflicts involving pedestrian access in Ashwood Terrace. You are requested to attend a private session to avoid escalation." There was no client name listed. Dana declined by not responding. Her lawyer sent a cease and desist notice the same evening, but the boundary had been tested, and now the response began. The next 3 days blurred into a series of escalating violations. Her mailbox was vandalized with expanding foam sealant, her garbage pickup skipped entirely without explanation, and her internet cut off in a scheduled maintenance outage that hadn't been announced. Her motion lights triggered every night between 2 and 3 a.m., always in the same location, always followed by the sound of movement just beyond the bushes. Each time she checked the camera feed, there were gaps, static, black bars, signal interruptions that hadn't existed before. Her lawyer arranged for a forensic review of the footage, but the tech who arrived gave her a look she didn't like, a look that said, "I can try, but don't expect miracles." Then came the legal letter. This one carried real weight. It was sent from a corporate law office representing Ashwood Holdings, and it accused Dana of interfering with future access infrastructure related to a proposed community enhancement corridor that, while not officially approved, had been submitted for consideration in a long-range development plan. The language was technical and layered in disclaimers, but the threat beneath it was clear. If she continued obstructing what they called a projected public right-of-way, she could be subject to injunctive relief. Dana read the phrase 3 times. Projected. Not current, not real, just an intention, a theory, and yet they were using it to threaten her property rights. Her lawyer prepared a counterbrief, citing her title, the county's confirmation of private ownership, and the prior note in the developer's original plans voiding any easement extension. But he warned her, they're not trying to win legally. They're trying to exhaust you. And it was working. Dana felt the strain in her bones, waking each day unsure of what would be taken next, what would be turned against her, which neighbor would go silent when she waved, which one was printing flyers behind closed doors. Still, she refused to back down. She hired a private fencing company, one that worked quietly and didn't ask questions, and had them install a secondary line of thorn-resistant fencing behind the surviving bushes. Not metal, not permanent, just enough of a physical deterrent to buy her time. She also upgraded her camera system with a hardline backup, bypassing Wi-Fi entirely. Every hour she wasn't working she spent in defense, strategizing, reinforcing, documenting. Then, without warning, came the petition for emergency hearing. Filed by a homeowner 3 blocks away, it accused Dana of endangering community welfare through aggressive territorial landscaping. The filing requested a temporary order to mandate removal of the bushes while the legal ownership of the path was reviewed for public interest. Her lawyer called the move absurd, but dangerous. They're playing chess, Dana. They're not trying to prove you wrong. They're trying to reframe the question. Make it about fear. Make it about threat. They want a judge to think you're unstable. Dana didn't attend the hearing alone. Her lawyer stood beside her, presenting every document, every photo, every recording, every map. The plaintiff never showed up. His representative cited personal discomfort due to escalating tension. It was a show, a performance, but the judge dismissed the emergency order due to lack of immediate risk. No victory dance, just a breath, a reprieve. That night, her porch light exploded, not a power surge. The bulb shattered. Someone had hit it. The camera picked up nothing. Again. The next morning, her neighbor, the one who had remained neutral for weeks, approached her in the driveway, looking nervous. He handed her a note and said, "I never saw anything. Just so you know." Dana opened the paper after he left. It was a meeting flyer for an upcoming board session. Someone had written across it in marker, "Your wall won't last. They want it more than you do." She didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because for the first time she wondered if they were right. Not in their tactics, not in their claims, but in their persistence. How long could she hold out? How long before the next line was crossed, and the next? How long before she made one mistake, one emotional misstep, and they pounced? But as she stood at her window staring out over the stunted trail and the jagged remnants of her bushes, she felt something shift. Not surrender. Something deeper. The knowledge that no one was coming to save her, that resilience wasn't about brute strength, it was about endurance. And if they wanted this land, they would have to take it inch by inch, in full view of the law, and the moment they did, they'd expose what they really were. Not stewards of community, but entitled tacticians in search of compliance. Dana didn't move. She stayed at that window until the sun rose, her hand resting on the windowsill, her breathing calm. They had escalated. And now it was her turn. The storm didn't hit when the weather app predicted. It held off, suspended in a heavy gray sky like a warning left unread. Dana had grown used to disruptions. The slashed bushes, the anonymous threats, the blackout cameras, every move had become predictable in its calculated hostility. But when nothing happened for several days, not a complaint, not a cryptic note, not a flash of motion after midnight, she understood the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure, tightening. Then her attorney called. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight. A request had been filed with the county by Ashwood Holdings. Not an individual homeowner, not a board committee, but the development corporation itself. They weren't arguing that Dana's bushes violated community aesthetic. They weren't accusing her of aggression or harassment. They had changed tactics entirely. They now claimed the path, cut through her land, was a pre-existing community asset, eligible for easement conversion under an obscure long-term development clause. If the county agreed, Dana could be forced to relinquish a portion of her land for public access. It was a sleight-of-hand move, paper-based warfare. They weren't trying to win through logic or right. They were going to drown her in bureaucracy until she broke. Attached to the filing were diagrams, maps, and manipulated photos showing a continuous path, hers included, traced in soft gray lines that implied inevitability. She recognized some of the images. A few were drone shots, clearly recent. Others were years old, blown up and marked by digital annotations. Worse, the filing included letters from unnamed residents, claiming decades of peaceful use, alleging that Dana's barrier vegetation had caused conflict and injury. No names, no signatures, just typed statements and implied consensus. Her attorney didn't sound panicked. He sounded cold, focused. They're hoping the county won't look closely. They're banking on you giving in before it becomes a public fight. He gave her a list of what they'd need to fight it. Property records, maintenance logs, photographic timelines, expert assessments. She already had most of it. But it was the final thing he said that hit deepest. They want to make you the problem, Dana. Not the path, not the process. You. She didn't speak. She stared at the red digital timestamp on her security feed as it blinked silently, counting seconds. The hearing wasn't in a courtroom. It was in a bland civic annex with linoleum floors and cheap overhead lights that made everyone look tired. There were 6 people on the review panel, none of whom had seen her property, none of whom lived in Ashwood. Just names and titles. Across from Dana sat the lawyer for Ashwood Holdings, young and smug, polished to a shine. He presented first, laying out his argument in clean, practiced legalese. The path had been used for decades. Continuity established a communal precedent. Refusal to recognize the easement harmed resident welfare. The words came out like numbers on a spreadsheet. Clinical, distant, confident. When it was Dana's turn, her attorney stood beside her, restrained but resolute. He presented not just her deed, but the original developer's plat map, where the path had been marked temporary and explicitly excluded from long-term rights-of-way. He showed time-stamped photos of the bushes, motion detection logs, trespass warnings, and, most importantly, the county letter verifying that her property was private and unencumbered. There was no emotional appeal, no tears, no plea for sympathy, only fact. The panel asked 3 questions, procedural, not accusatory, and then adjourned for review. No decision was given that day. Dana walked out of the room without looking at the Ashwood rep. She didn't need to. She had seen enough courtroom strategies to know the game now was attrition. Whoever blinked first, lost. That night, as rain began to fall, she stood on her back porch watching water collect in the gravel trench just behind the thorn bushes. Her security lights clicked on, one after the other, soft halos blinking through the wet leaves. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. But the wind smelled different, like earth turned over by people who thought they owned it. At dawn, she found a plastic cup left on the gravel path, filled with coffee grounds and rainwater. On the lid, someone had written in marker, "This land belonged to all of us once." There was no name, no context, just the sentence. Dana didn't throw it away. She set it on the shelf above her desk and stared at it every time she opened another file, another log, another response letter, because that cup said what the paperwork wouldn't. It said, "You're not up against an error. You're up against belief." And belief didn't yield to documents. It had to be outlasted. So she stayed. She rebuilt the missing bushes. She reinforced the back line with gravel-infused soil and root nets. She replaced her cameras with a wired system immune to jamming. She logged every strange motion, every incident, every name she could verify from the falsified statements. She filed a complaint of her own, public misrepresentation and malicious interference with land title, backed by notarized documents and professional surveys. Because Dana had finally stopped fighting for the trail. She was fighting for what the trail represented, the idea that people could rewrite reality by pretending long enough, loudly enough, and collectively enough that it became true. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not here. Not to her. The next hearing was set for 3 weeks out, and this time it wouldn't be administrative. It would be public, binding, and every lie written down would have to be read aloud. She was ready. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m., but Dana arrived early. Not because she was afraid, she wasn't, but because she understood the value of calm preparation in a setting where appearances were as weaponized as words. Her attorney had already arrived, meticulously setting out labeled binders and paper stacks across their table with the slow precision of someone who intended to win, not through performance, but by exhausting the opposition with relentless clarity. Dana took a seat beside him, her face neutral, spine straight, the exhaustion of months concealed behind the discipline of stillness. There were maybe 15 people in the room when the session opened, most from the county, 2 from Ashwood Holdings, 1 unfamiliar woman who sat in the back row and scribbled notes without looking up. The Ashwood representative began with an opening that dripped with engineered moderation. He didn't accuse Dana directly. Instead, he spoke in terms of disruption, of uncooperative land use, of missed opportunities for communal synergy. He referenced the letters, the maps, the photographs, all edited, cropped, framed to imply that Dana's resistance had created a hazard where once there had been cohesion. He was persuasive, but not precise, and Dana had learned the power of precision. Her attorney spoke next, his voice quieter but every word sharpened by fact. He laid out a sequence that couldn't be dismissed. The original developer's notation that the path was temporary, the lack of any official dedication, the false signatures in the petition, the falsified drone imagery. He introduced the letter from the county clerk affirming Dana's full exclusive ownership. Then he took out the final exhibit, a notarized affidavit from the head of the original zoning team, now retired, who confirmed in writing that no communal path had ever been approved, mapped, or legally proposed. It was a blunt object dropped on a fragile structure. For a moment, the Ashwood attorney said nothing. When he did, it was to ask for a recess. It was denied. The board deliberated for just under 40 minutes. Dana didn't move. She barely breathed. When the decision was announced, it came without fanfare, without any satisfaction in the tone. The board found in Dana's favor. The path had no legal standing. The land in question was private and free of encumbrances. The panel further recommended that Ashwood Holdings cease any further pursuit of path designation through her property, and noted that the development's prior actions raised concerns regarding procedural manipulation. It wasn't just a win, it was a rebuke. Dana didn't smile. She didn't speak. She gathered her documents slowly, methodically, as the Ashwood representatives exited the room without a word. There were no apologies. There never would be. But the silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was defeated. The woman in the back row who'd taken notes approached Dana quietly. She introduced herself as an independent urban policy researcher working on a report about civic overreach in private developments. She asked if Dana would be willing to speak on record in the future. Dana declined gently. "Not now," she said. "Maybe never." The woman nodded. "What you did mattered. Most people don't make it this far." When Dana returned home that afternoon, the air felt different. Heavier, but cleaner. There were no notes pinned to her door. No coffee cups left in symbolic defiance. Just the sound of wind moving through the thorn bushes she had rebuilt herself, row after row of them, silent guardians of a line they had tried to erase. She walked the path, not the trail but her own gravel perimeter, checking each anchor, each hedge, each root. Her cameras held steady. The system was intact. There had been no retaliation during her absence, no intrusion. No victory lap from the losing side. Later that evening, as dusk turned the sky violet, Dana lit the porch light and sat on the steps with a glass of water, not wine. She didn't need celebration. What she needed was to feel the full gravity of what she had endured, to allow the